I'm not interested now in just maintaining my assets. I'm interested in managing the entire life cycle of my assets.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the Digital Supply Chain Podcast, the #1 podcast focusing on the digitization of supply chain. And I'm your host, Global Vice President at SAP, Tom Raftery. Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery with SAP. And before we start today's show, I got a wonderful email the other day from someone called Rona Vazilar of Bliss Integrated. And Rona said, "Hi Tom, I just wanted to say that I recently started listening to your podcast and I love it. I'm learning more about supply chain for my job and I was a little lost on it until I started listening. I'm working backwards, so I've listened to your newest episodes first. My favorite is the episode on Li-Fi technology. I didn't even know that existed. Anyway, I just wanted to say I appreciate what you do and will definitely be a regular listener on your show. I can't wait for the new episode I saw you just dropped today. I'm interested in geopolitical risk and supply chains as I specialize in China studies, and that's obviously a hot topic right now. Hope you have a great weekend. Thanks again, Rona." Rona, thanks a million for that. Doing podcasts can be hard because, you don't often get feedback, so it's wonderful to get feedback like that. So thanks so much, Rona. Having done that, on with today's show, and my special guest on the show today is another Tom. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom, for the opportunity. My name is Tom Kurtz. I am with SAP, and I work specifically in our supply chain practice around asset management.
Lovely. And it's cool that you're coming on, Tom. Thanks a million for agreeing to come on the show. It's cool because asset management isn't something that we've discussed a lot on the show. So talk to me about that. I mean, what is an asset? Why would you want to manage it? What kind of management can you do? The whole thing. Sure,
absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity. I am as they say, long-time listener, first-time caller. So thank you for the opportunity to come on to not only double your Tom output, but also talk more about asset management. So I'll tie it back to something that is near and dear to you and your audience, is around supply chains. And you've talked about it some on your show. I'm sure most audience members are seeing this in the world today because of where we are with the coronavirus and the impact it has had to the global economy. There is an opportunity we see the opportunity of the supply chain, the importance of supply chain more than ever. And because of that, the part where assets play, it's really the equipment, the machines that make that supply chain go around. And so those machines you can look at from different perspectives. So the terms you hear a lot, or the entities you hear a lot about in asset management, manufacturers, or sometimes called OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. They are the entities that build machines, build product, if you will. They call it their product. That's what they're manufacturing. There are the owner-operators, so the operators of that equipment. So I buy an asset from a manufacturer. I use it for my purposes, which, by the way, could also be as a manufacturer, because I use equipment to do that. Thus, the chain continues, if you will. You hear about service providers, so those that fix said equipment. So when the equipment breaks down, you want to keep it up and running in order to have your optimal efficiency of production. You want to have your machines working at their most optimal pace along the way. So that's what an asset is. You refer to it as equipment. You'll hear it called devices. You'll hear it called different things, but that's really the world. So asset management then is the management of that.
Super. And we've seen a huge shift in the last, I want to say, decade. I'll just round it out. Maybe it's a little longer, maybe it's a little shorter. But we've seen a huge shift from dumb assets to smart assets. We're getting assets now with built-in smarts and connectivity. And how is that changing the world of supply chain?
Tremendously. I think, you hit it on the head in terms of from dumb to smart. So you're hearing a lot more discussion of intelligent assets, connected assets. You hear terms like Industry 4.0, industrial internet. Sometimes those are regionally based, but all those things really get at what you've hit on, which is this idea that we can do more with assets today. And that really impacts a lot of those stakeholders that I just talked about. It impacts them.
And just to interrupt you there for a second, we should actually clarify that not just have we shifted from dumb assets to smart assets, we've also shifted that you can make dumb assets smart. You can add smarts and connectivity to existing assets. So it's like a kind of a brownfield situation.
You can, and there's different approaches to that. I mean, I think where I was going with the entities, a lot of manufacturers are now seeing it as a value add. So I've talked to operators, those companies that use equipment from their suppliers, and they pretty universally say, look, this is a benefit to us. We recognize that if our manufacturers build these sensors build this intelligence into the product, that helps us. We're willing to pay a premium for that. Right. So that's something the manufacturer's looking at, saying, hey, that's a competitive advantage for me to be able to say, I'm going to make my assets more intelligent so that my operators are getting the benefit of that. Or I, as a manufacturer, it opens up a lot of opportunity, because I, as a manufacturer, might also see it as an incremental revenue stream for me. Maybe I don't want, I talked earlier about a service provider, a manufacturer. Those could be the same entity. A manufacturer could say, Tom, I'm not going to just sell you a piece of equipment. I want to sell you a service. I want to sell you value-added services around that piece of equipment. So you don't necessarily need to buy the asset. And now it's just from CapEx to OpEx. Yeah. It's not, you're not just buying all this equipment and then dealing with your expense line item in terms of how to manage that equipment. Maybe you want that service from your manufacturer. And that's, of course, something for each individual entity or company to make. But the flexibility is created. And we all know that with flexibility, with the technology enablement comes opportunity.
Okay. And I mean, there are all kinds of things that this enables, right? I mean, you can enable the likes of a shift from scheduled maintenance to predictive maintenance. You can have a whole business shift, as you alluded to there, from selling products to selling services. I mean, we had NVIDIA Robotics on last week talking about they're doing robots as a service. Okay. How are companies dealing with these kind of shifts? Because it is a huge shift, not just the way of going, from scheduled maintenance to predictive maintenance. That's not as big a shift, I have to think, as the whole business model shift, which for companies shifting a business model has all kinds of implications. I mean, we're seeing it ourselves in SAP, where we're shifting from selling on-prem to shifting to cloud, which is a similar kind of paradigm shift.
It is. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the on-premise to cloud, because I think so. You covered hit on a couple of really good things there. One is when you look at on-premise to cloud, that is the mentality there is, I, as an operator of this on-premise software, I don't want to be the operator of it anymore. I want to outsource as much of that as I can, or whatever my model allows me to do. So that's what sort of the value prop of cloud in a way is. Okay, I can, SAP, for example, has cloud software. If I'm an SAP customer, I can say, I don't want to manage this internally anymore. I can shift my IT model. SAP, you can manage more of it. Now, it's a similar way with the as a service that we talked about. It's that similar mindset of, I don't necessarily want to manage this on a day-to-day basis. I want to outsource that to my supplier. So that's an example there. But one other thing that you really hit on that I want to point out is, you're right, this shift. I think you see it even in just in terms of how the analysts in the market talk about it. So historically, you heard a term, an acronym called EAM, Enterprise Asset Management. And that's been around for decades. That's the world of maintenance and work order management. So the ability to plan around maintenance. So maintenance planners and organizations, those are individuals that worry about, how am I going to plan out all the maintenance that all my assets need in my organization. The work execution, so the actual putting out there of work orders for the technicians to execute on. Speaking of technicians, the resource scheduling, so scheduling systems, how do I manage the workers that are out there? Mobility systems, so those technicians, especially in the days of COVID today, I don't necessarily want to go into the office every morning before I get in my truck and go out and do the servicing in my warehouse, in the different factories I have, but I want to be able to have mobile devices and have access to that work order. So that's the world of EAM, the historical world of enterprise asset management. Sure. You're now seeing a lot more what the market's calling APM, asset performance management. And so I was at an event last year where I heard a customer, and I always use this because I really like how she put it. Her statement was, I'm not interested now in just maintaining my assets. I'm interested in managing the entire life cycle of my assets.
Okay.
So then so what does that mean? What else is in the life cycle other than this? So if everything I just described in EAM gets at the manage the maintenance, execution, and the planning and management, APM, asset performance management, gets at more of the strategic and what you were talking about, the more predictive side of things.
Okay.
So some of the capabilities you see there is I want to strategize and segment my assets differently. So you think about it, if I have a factory of assets that I'm managing, they're not all the same, and I shouldn't treat them all the same, and I shouldn't make maintenance plans that have costs associated with them that are the same. So in other words, this basket of assets on the left might have less frequent failures. They don't go down as much.
Okay.
Or when they do go down, it's not a big deal. It's not expensive. There's no safety criticality, what they call criticality. So there's less risk, less criticality. This batch of assets and equipment on the right might be different. It might be they go down more frequently, or when they do go down, it's a big deal. There's the risk and criticality is higher. Gotcha. So by just naturally, I would probably want to treat those two segments differently. So having systems that can help me put my strategies together. How do I do my maintenance strategy? So that's not about execution. That's about upfront strategizing around how I'm going to handle my assets.
Interesting.
You mentioned about and you mentioned about the predictive side too. That's another piece of enterprise asset management. The ability to manage these work orders is more reactive. It's very valuable and it's very necessary, but can I augment that? Can I also, these assets, as we mentioned, are much smarter now. They're able to communicate things to us through the sensors embedded. So can I, through that information, apply machine learning to it, apply what we call condition monitoring. So just being able to read the assets or read the measures directly, the indicators directly, that helps me plan more proactively as well. So now when you start to bring all this together, and the third piece of capability on APM would be around collaboration. So all these providers that I talked to are all these stakeholders, those making the machines, those operating the machines, those fixing the machines. The ability for all of them to be on the same network and share information about those, the same way a logistics network would work or a procurement network would work. This is a maintenance network, the ability to, it's an asset network, the ability to be able to connect there. So now you bring all these together, you're going back to what that woman said at the event last year. She's not just maintaining her assets, she's now managing the entire life cycle of those assets.
Okay. Prioritizing, as you rightly said, prioritizing one over another. If it's a machine that is critical to the manufacture of your devices, it can't go down. So you have to make absolutely sure that you're getting all the data from it. Whereas if it's one over on the left side, maybe it's part of the paint job or something that if it goes down, doesn't really matter so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that method, they would call it run to failure. It's still a valid method to say we are going to let this fail. You know why? Because I can make a phone call and I have a spare part tomorrow, or we've got inventory of the spare parts. So it's not, again, your risk and criticality assessment says this isn't a big deal if this one fails. These other ones that are, I'm going to treat differently.
Fascinating. And on a different topic, kind of different topic, I guess. We're still talking assets and connected assets and things. Mm-hmm. I know that, for example, I mean, there are lots of different stories about, assets as a service. You've got Philips Lighting is a classic example, although I think they're called Signify now. They own all the lights in the city of Los Angeles, for example. And, there are loads more examples like the Invia Robotics one I mentioned earlier. One of the cool things about having connected assets, and one of the obvious ones, is that you can use the data back from those devices for billing purposes. It's an obvious one. You have to have that in place or else you can't send bills. You have to know how much the devices are being used. But another use of that data is that traditionally, when devices were not connected, manufacturers had to kind of, stick their finger in the air and go, well, I guess our devices in the wild are being used in this way, in these kind of environments, and this is what I should optimize for in my manufacturing of those devices. But now the manufacturers have got access to all that data from how the devices are actually being used in the wild, and now they can feed this data into their R&D and say, look, this is how the devices are actually being used. Maybe the next version of the device should have more, let's say, temperature variety that it can. I don't know what the correct terminology for this is, but a wider range of temperatures that it can operate under, or a wider range of humidity, or maybe it should be able to operate for longer or shorter periods, or whatever else it is. Is that something that we're actually seeing? I mean, it's an obvious use case, but is it something that's actually being used in the wild?
It absolutely is, and I'm really glad you went down that path, Tom, because I think this is what I would refer to that as is really a closed loop process between design and operation. So at SAP, anyway, we talk about we talk about 5 stages: design, plan, build, deliver, or manufacture, deliver, and operate. Uh-huh. And so those are kind of the different stages. And you've had a lot of guests over your episodes talking about different stages of that, whether it be logistics, business planning, and so forth. This operate piece technically comes at the end. The design piece technically comes at the beginning. The beginning and the end, that's a linear statement. And what we are wanting to do is create more of a cycle, a circular motion and closed loop process for that, because that'll happen right now. And I think a great example of this in our own world at SAP is with a newly announced partner with Siemens. So Siemens is obviously they manufacture equipment, but they do software on the PLM side, the product lifecycle management, a lot of the design and engineering. As a part of that, there's a function called service engineering and service planning. So I talk about asset management, EAM and APM and all that I've already talked about. You'll hear Siemens talk about SLM, service lifecycle management, because what will happen is coming out of that engineering process, there's information that absolutely downstream you want. So you have something called an EBOM in the engineering world, engineering bill of materials, that translates in the manufacturing world into an MBOM, manufacturing bill of materials. It translates into the service and asset world as an SBOM, service bill of materials. Right. So what the engineers are saying is, hey, service technicians, this is what you need. This is the service parts that are going to be required. This is the working instructions. This is information like that from a service planning standpoint. These are the failure modes that you might incur. This is what would potentially cause it to fail. These are the frequencies within which we expect. So all that information, you can imagine the advantage your operations team can have with that information. Same way as you just said, now we have all the engineers, this is what we think is going to happen. This is, we're going to build now once you have the actually operating in the real world, it's not design anymore. It is actuals. It's operation in the real world. To your point, let's feed that back in. So that's the catalyst for the SAP Siemens relationship. And I think you're seeing this in a lot of organizations. Those stakeholders, again, going back to the manufacturers, the operators and the service providers, having an ability to connect all the information through something like a business network is important, and being able to integrate systems. And so we are seeing it in the wild. Absolutely.
Interesting. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that, they're getting a lot of information, because these connected assets, I mean, if we think about, let's say, a smart meter, because I happen to come from an energy background. So I happen to know a bit about, utility meters, and typically the data coming from a meter would come from a meter read every month or every 2 months. And so you get one reading every 2 months. And when you change that to one smart meter reading every 15 minutes or whatever it is, you're talking about thousands of reads per day or per week, instead of one every 2 months. So you're talking way more information coming in, and that's for one smart meter or one asset, one device, whatever it is. And you multiply that out by tens of thousands of devices or assets that you manufacture. And, as you keep manufacturing, that builds up and up and up. And, that brings us to the kind of topic of big data. And you mentioned earlier as well the fact that we're seeing a shift to cloud. And I think the two things got to be related, because the manufacturers are not in the business of, standing up data centers to handle all this sudden flood of information from their connected devices. So this has got to be a big factor as well behind the shift to cloud, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I've been in this asset management business for a while, but I've even longer been tied to our IoT practices at SAP, and one of our more successful customers, they didn't start. I used to joke, IoT was such a buzzword and still is a buzzword, but no one calls me asking how many IoTs can I buy from you, right? Or how many. That's just not IoT is an enabling function, but like one of the successful customer, it was a data problem. It was a train company, and they had it was. And when it comes to train companies, it's not just we have a carriage or we have a car. It's that car has an HVAC system with it, and it has doors that open and shut, and it has a brake system, and it has all these different things, and those are all censored, and so those all have parts. And so this company had terabytes of data that they didn't have a strategy for. And so the other thing they had is a gigantic maintenance budget item, right? I mean, they spent a lot on maintenance every year.
Yeah.
So they put those two together and said, can you help us structure a data architecture? And then once we understand how we're going to manage this data, we can decide what to do with this data. So it all started with a business problem, which is we spend a lot on maintenance. And then someone also said, well, we have a lot of data about the things we fix. How do we put something like this together? So it's absolutely the case. Data is a big part of it. I think how companies manage that information. And that's the other thing too, is there's different, I mean, we're not going to get into all the details in our time here, but you start to get into things like edge computing. How much do you want to process at the edge before you centralize it into a central cloud data store and so forth? So there's definitely different touch points when you come to getting these connected devices and actually doing smart things with your smart devices.
Okay. And where is it all going, Tom? What's coming down the line in asset management? What's the next big thing?
The next big thing in asset management, I do think what we touched on in terms of this closed loop with the engineering, a better linkage between the engineering and the operations. I do think there's a ton of potential, a ton of opportunity there. I think it is something that we're doing, but I think we've just scratched the surface of it. I think it's when we announced our relationship with Siemens, that we had a lot of customers joking that, oh, we've been waiting for this. This is, because they have Siemens equipment. They use Siemens from a PLM perspective, SAP operations, whatever, but they see an opportunity there. So I do think that's one of the next big things. And I think it's also related to that is this, just where this world of supply chain has been going with Industry 4.0, with this idea of intelligent factories being able to drive that thing called OEE, equipment effectiveness, optimal equipment effectiveness, and being able to really be effective in how we do that and have quality in what we produce, have uptime in the assets that we use to produce it. All of that's going to continue to be big, I believe.
Interesting. Yeah. You talked about the maintenance in the train company, and that's a nice win. I remember that story well. It's a nice win because it saves the train company a truckload of money, but it also means that passengers are safer.
Load, right? Is the case.
A carriage load of money.
Load, sure.
But it also means it's a big safety win as well.
Absolutely.
The train company's customers are safer. And if we think as well about feeding that data from the operation back into the engineering, it means that a lot of devices can now, because it's being seen how they're being used in the wild, can not only become more efficient, but also safer. The efficiency wins mean that it's a sustainability win, because you're not, making stuff that's going to be used differently to how you thought. The energy use of the device over its lifetime is going to be far better optimized. So and people are going to be safer as a result. So it's a double sustainability win, I think. Is Is that the only kind of sustainability wins we get out of this, or are there other things that I've not thought of?
Well, I think, I definitely think that's a big thing. You use the term optimization, and I do think you're optimizing a lot. Whether it be, like you said, you're getting you're getting better at predicting things, or at least getting validation back. And so that closed loop process between engineering and operations, we talked about the effectiveness of we're naturally going to make this better. So there's definitely sustainability there. I mean, I think maybe one thing I'd add to it is you're getting the equipment is continuing to get more efficient along the way as well, right? The same way, I mean, this is going into the residential world, but washers and dryers are more efficient. Bathroom facilities are more efficient. I mean, things that the technology in which one uses to create these things continue. And so what's happening is, again, you bring that chain back into play. If manufacturer A is making a better product that manufacturer B is using to make their product that C uses, and so on, you're getting the aggregated, the compounded benefit along the chain as well, because the more everyone along the way is using more efficient equipment, you're creating sustainability along that, and which is important too in terms of, when you're picking your suppliers and what you're holding your suppliers to in terms of effective equipment production.
There's always this thought at the back of my head. I'm not sure if you've come across the expression, the 10x problem. It's kind of a consumer term which is used about smart devices in the home. So the 10x problem is that if you get a smart connected light bulb, it's typically 10 times the price of a dumb light bulb. Or if you get a smart connected doorbell or lock or camera or sprinkler system or whatever else it is, they tend to be roughly 10 times the price of their dumb equivalent. But right at the very start of this, when you're talking about assets, you talked about how organizations, manufacturers are happy to pay for this extra connectivity. In the manufacturing sphere, it's not going to be a 10x. It's probably going to be a 2 to 3x at most.
Right.
And they get a massive economic benefit from it. Whereas in the home situation, not so much. You get to play with your HomeKit device or your Google device or your Alexa device or whatever it is and have things talk to each other, but there's no big economic win from it. So it's two very different worlds. It's kind of a very stark difference between the two.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, I think that you hit on something too. You're going to naturally see in the industrial world, in the commercial world, you're going to naturally see some economies of scale that you might not get in the residential world, especially when you tie the maintenance cost to it, because that's exactly what there's a particular one a case in point. I was talking to an oil company, oil and gas company, and that they were the one that specifically said, look, we do so much around maintenance, and obviously we want to be efficient with this. The more we can have connected assets, the more, because if we try to retrofit something, to your point earlier, you can do that. But the more I have this already coming from the manufacturer, the easier everybody is. So I'd rather pay a little bit more upfront to save, and I'm going to, and the amount of time I'm going to use that asset, I'm going to pay a little bit more upfront, and then I'm going to get years or whatever the number is of maintenance efficiencies, and you can figure out the ROI and when the payoff break even is and so forth. But that's exactly right. I'm not thinking about that necessarily with my light bulb, but I'm sure as heck thinking about that with my, my $50,000 piece of equipment.
Tom, we've gone way over the 20-minute mark. Is there, because it's been such an interesting conversation, which is always a good sign. Is there anything that we've not touched on that you think it's important that people be aware of?
One thing I would say is, and we're seeing this at SAP right now. So everything I just talked about, you're right. I'm not surprised we went over, because it's fascinating stuff, but it also is real. There's real dollars here, but there's also real complexity. I mean, we were talking machine learning, we're talking simulation, we're talking different connections to a business network. So there's different levels of complexity one can get. And one thing I'd advise those listening, or if you're consulting with companies that would be targets for this, we do recognize the opportunity to start in a managed way as well. In fact, SAP, that's one of the things that we're doing now, is putting a bundled package together with some of our solutions that do this, so that companies, they can get started pretty quickly, with a small number of devices, with without doing all the detailed machine learning, that can come later. Without doing a lot of supplier on the network, that can come later. But like getting a small number of suppliers up, getting a small number of devices up, getting some initial condition monitoring going against the sensors there. That's something that can be done in a pretty managed way. And so that's one thing, maybe a parting word for your audience is there's like everything else, there's degrees of this and levels of sophistication, and the ability to start small is absolutely there.
Tremendous, tremendous. Tom, if people want to know more about yourself, Tom Kurtz, or about asset management, or about those package solutions you mentioned, or anything else, where would you have me direct them?
A couple places. SAP.com is always a great place for general information. If you go to SAP.com/EAM, that enterprise asset management, SAP.com/EAM, there's a lot of information about a lot of the capabilities that we've talked about here today. On a personal level, LinkedIn is probably the easiest. My last name is spelled Kurtz.
Excellent. Excellent. Tom, that's been fantastic. Thanks a million for coming on the show today.
Tom, thank you.
Okay, we've come to the end of the show. Thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to know more about digital supply chains, head on over to sap.com/digital supply chain, or simply drop me an email to tom.raftery@sap.com. If you like the show, please don't forget to subscribe to it in your podcast application of choice to get new episodes as soon as they're published. Also, please don't forget to rate and review the podcast. It really does help new people to find the show. Thanks. Catch you all next time.